I've been hiking the backcountry of Monongahela National Forest since I was 22 years old. That's 15 years of weekends and vacation days spent on trails that most people don't know exist. Trails that don't appear in the guidebooks or on the popular hiking apps. Trails that you find only by walking the mountains long enough that they start to reveal themselves to you, the way an old house reveals its hidden rooms to someone who's lived there long enough to notice the doors. I'm not saying that to impress anyone. I'm saying it because I need you to understand that when I tell you I found a trail I'd never seen before, in terrain I knew as well as my own neighborhood, it means something. It means something was wrong. Not wrong the way a missed turn is wrong, or a fallen tree across a familiar path is wrong. Wrong the way a room in your house having a window you've never noticed is wrong. Wrong at the level of basic reality, the kind of wrong that makes you question not just what you're seeing, but whether the place you thought you knew ever existed in the form you believed it did. It was the third week of September 2021. I'd taken a Friday off work and driven down from Elkins to do a solo overnight loop through Cranberry Wilderness, a route I'd done probably 30 times over the years. The plan was to enter from the north, follow the ridge trail south above Williams River, drop down to the river, camp near the confluence with the North Fork, and hike out the next morning on the return leg. Simple, familiar. The kind of hike where your body does the work and your mind gets to wander because your feet know the trail better than your eyes do. The weather was perfect. Mid-60s, clear sky, the first hints of fall color showing in the maples and birches, the oaks still holding their dark summer green. I started walking around 9 in the morning and made the ridge by 11, stopping to eat a sandwich on a rock outcrop that gave me a view of the Williams River Valley spread out below, all green canopy and blue distance, and the faint silver thread of the river catching sunlight through gaps in the trees. I'd sat on that same rock dozens of times. I could have drawn the view from memory. Everything was exactly as it should have been. I dropped off the ridge around noon, following the trail I always took, a well-worn path that descended through a series of switchbacks into older timber, where the trees were massive and the understory was sparse, and the light filtered through the canopy and shafts that moved with the wind. I was maybe 20 minutes into the descent, moving at an easy pace, when I saw the junction. It was on my left, a trail branching off the main path, heading northeast, cutting through a stand of old-growth red spruce that I knew well. I'd passed through this section countless times, and there had never been a trail here. Not a game trail, not a faint social trail worn by other hikers, not an old logging road grown over. Nothing. This section of forest was trackless between the main trail and the ridge to the east, a thick block of spruce and rhododendron that you'd need a machete to get through. But here was a trail, and it wasn't new. It was worn, the soil packed down to a smooth, hard surface by what must have been years of foot traffic. The vegetation on either side trimmed back to create a corridor about 3 feet wide. Someone had been using this trail regularly for a long time. Someone, or many someones, had walked this path often enough to beat it into the earth the way the main trails were beaten, and they'd done it in a part of the forest where I would have bet my life no trail existed. I stood at the junction for several minutes, trying to make sense of it. I pulled out my map, the USGS topographic sheet that I carried on every hike, and checked my position. I knew exactly where I was. The junction should not have been there. I checked the Gaia GPS app on my phone. Same result. No trail, no path, no indication that any route existed heading northeast from this point. The satellite imagery showed unbroken forest canopy. Whatever I was looking at, it existed on the ground, but not on any map, any image, any record. I should have stayed on the main trail. That's what any reasonable person would have done, and I'm a reasonable person most of the time. But 15 years of hiking these mountains had given me a curiosity about the backcountry that sometimes overrode my better judgment, and I'd never found an unmapped trail before, and the part of me that loved these mountains for their secrets wanted to know where it went. I told myself I'd follow it for 30 minutes, see where it led, and turn back if it didn't connect to anything I recognized. The trail descended into the spruce forest, winding between massive trunks that rose like columns in a cathedral, the canopy so dense overhead that the light dropped to a greenish twilight. The path was clear and easy to follow, the surface packed smooth, the corridor maintained with what looked like deliberate care. Someone had been cutting back the rhododendron on both sides, and recently, I could see fresh-cut marks on the stems, the wood still white and sappy where it had been severed. This wasn't an abandoned trail that nature was reclaiming. This was an active path that someone was keeping open. I found the first cairn about a mile in. It was sitting at a junction where the trail split, one branch continuing northeast and the other turning east toward the ridge. The cairn was a neat stack of flat stones, maybe 2 feet tall, built with the careful precision of someone who understood the craft. Each stone was selected for its shape and laid level, and the whole structure had a permanence to it that suggested it had been there for a while, though the stones showed no moss or lichen growth, which meant they'd been placed or rebuilt recently. I checked my map again. Nothing. No junction, no trail, no feature that corresponded to what I was standing in front of. I took the northeast branch and kept walking. The cairns continued, spaced every 100 yards or so, marking the trail with a consistency that spoke of planning and purpose. They weren't random piles of stones thrown up by a casual hiker. They were navigation aids, carefully placed at points where the trail curved or the terrain changed, ensuring that whoever used this path could follow it without difficulty even in poor visibility. Someone had built a trail system in the backcountry of Monongahela National Forest, complete with blazes and cairns and maintained corridors, and they'd done it without appearing on any map or being noticed by any other hiker I'd ever talked to. The hollow deepened as I descended. The spruce gave way to hemlock, and the hemlock grew denser until the trunks were so close together I could have touched two at once with my arms outstretched. The light was almost gone now, filtered through so many layers of canopy that the forest floor existed in a permanent dusk. The trail narrowed but remained clear, winding between the trunks, and the cairns continued their steady markers. I checked the time. I'd been walking for 45 minutes, 15 more than I'd promised myself. I should have turned back. But the trail was descending towards something. I could feel it in the grade, and the way the hollow was closing in on both sides, and the part of me that should have been cautious was overridden by the part that needed to know what was at the bottom. The clearing appeared without warning. One moment I was in dense hemlock forest, and the next I stepped through a gap in the trees and found myself at the edge of an open space maybe 60 feet across, roughly circular, carpeted in short moss, with no trees growing inside its perimeter. The transition from forest to clearing was sharp, almost geometric, as if something had drawn a line and told the trees to stop here. The ground was flat and the moss was thick and green and undisturbed, except in the center, where the chairs were. There were 12 of them, handmade, constructed from green wood that still had the bark on in places, lashed together at the joints with a combination of wire and stripped bark. They were simple in design, almost primitive, just 4 legs and a seat and a backrest, but they were sturdy and well built, the joints tight, the seats smooth. They were arranged in a perfect circle, facing inward, each chair equidistant from its neighbors, creating a ring about 20 feet in diameter. The precision of the arrangement was unsettling, not approximate, not roughly circular, but mathematically precise, as if someone had measured the angles and distances with instruments. 12 chairs, 12 positions, each one facing the center of the circle, where there was nothing but moss and a ring of disturbed earth that might have been a fire pit or might have been something else. I walked to the nearest chair and examined it. The seat was worn smooth, not by weather, but by use, the wood polished by the friction of bodies sitting and shifting over what must have been months or years. The wire lashings were tight and showed no rust, suggesting they'd been replaced or tightened recently. Fresh wood shavings lay scattered on the ground around several of the chairs, the pale curls of green wood that you get from carving or whittling, and they were fresh, still moist, still carrying the sharp smell of sap. Someone had been here within the last day or two, sitting in these chairs, carving wood, doing whatever else they did in this hidden clearing at the bottom of an unmarked hollow in the middle of the national forest. I looked at the ground more carefully. The moss around the circle was trampled in patterns that made my stomach tighten. Footprints, dozens of them, pressed into the soft ground in trails that circled the chairs and wove between them and crossed each other in loops and spirals that looked choreographed. The prints were all bare feet, adult-sized, ranging from what I estimated was a men's 10 to a women's 7, all barefoot, all pressed deep enough into the moss to suggest deliberate, heavy steps. The patterns weren't random. They were repeated, the same paths walked over and over, creating grooves in the moss that described shapes I didn't want to interpret, circles within circles, figure 8s around specific chairs, lines that radiated from the center like spokes of a wheel. Whatever had been happening here, it was organized, it was repeated, and it involved a dozen or more people walking barefoot in precise patterns around a circle of handmade chairs in a hollow that no map acknowledged existed. I took photographs with my phone. I took photographs of the chairs, the footprints, the cairns, the trail. I took them quickly, because the feeling that had been building since I'd entered the clearing had crossed from unease into something closer to fear. The silence was wrong. Not just quiet, but actively silent. The way a room goes silent when everyone in it is holding their breath. No birds, no insects, no wind in the canopy. The forest around the clearing was watching me with the particular attention of a place that knows it's been found by someone who wasn't supposed to find it. I turned to leave. I walked back to the gap in the trees where I'd entered the clearing and stopped. The trail was gone. Not overgrown, not obscured, not hard to find. Gone. Where the clear, worn path had delivered me to the clearing minutes earlier, there was now only forest. Dense hemlock, rhododendron thickets, undisturbed undergrowth with no indication that any human foot had ever passed through it. I pushed into the trees anyway, fighting through the rhododendron in the direction I knew the trail had been, and after 50 yards of thrashing through brush that tore at my clothes and scratched my face, I found a cairn. But it wasn't pointing back the way I'd come. It was pointing deeper into the hollow, northeast, toward terrain I didn't know. I found 3 more cairns over the next hour. Each one pointed in a different direction than I expected, each one leading me along paths that appeared and disappeared unpredictably, opening up for 50 yards of clear walking before closing into impenetrable thicket. I was being redirected, guided. The trail system that had led me in was now leading me somewhere else, and the cairns were cooperating, their careful stone stacks pointing with deliberate authority toward destinations I hadn't chosen. I abandoned the cairns. I pulled out my compass, took a bearing west toward the main trail, and pushed straight through the forest, ignoring the paths, ignoring the cairns, fighting through underbrush by brute force. It took me over 2 hours to cover what should have been a mile of forest. The undergrowth was vicious, the rhododendron forming walls I had to crawl under or climb over, the terrain dropping and rising in ways that my topographic map didn't show. But I kept the bearing, and eventually, scratched and exhausted and shaking with a fear I couldn't fully articulate, I broke out onto the main trail. I knew where I was immediately. I was on the descent route I'd been following that morning, maybe a quarter mile below where the junction had been. I looked uphill toward where I'd found the unmarked trail. There was nothing there, just forest, dense and unbroken, the spruce and hemlock growing in an impenetrable mass that showed no gap, no corridor, no indication that any trail had ever existed. I hiked out. I didn't camp that night. I walked the remaining 4 miles to the trailhead in the fading light and drove back to Elkins and sat in my apartment and looked at the photographs on my phone. They were there. The chairs, the footprints, the cairns, the trail, all of it documented in clear digital images that proved I hadn't imagined what I'd found. 12 handmade chairs in a perfect circle, dozens of bare footprints in ritualistic patterns, a trail system that someone had built and maintained in secret, deep in the national forest, for purposes I couldn't begin to understand. I went back 2 weeks later. I found the descent trail, found the exact point where the junction had been. There was nothing. I searched for an hour, pushing into the forest on either side of the main trail, looking for any sign of the path I'd followed. No trail, no cut marks on the rhododendron, no worn ground, no cairns. The forest was undisturbed, as if it had never been opened, as if the trail and the clearing and the chairs had been a hallucination that left photographic evidence. I've shown those photos to friends, to other hikers, to a forest ranger I know who's worked in Monongahela for 20 years. Everyone agrees the images show what I say they show. No one can explain them. The ranger checked the area by GPS coordinates and found nothing but unbroken forest. He suggested maybe I'd been in a different part of the wilderness than I thought, that maybe the clearing was somewhere else and I'd gotten confused about the location. But I wasn't confused. I know those trails. I know that forest. And I know that on a September afternoon in 2021, a trail appeared where no trail had been, led me to a place that shouldn't exist, and then closed behind me like a door. I still hike Monongahela. I still walk those trails every chance I get, but I don't follow unmarked paths anymore. I don't investigate junctions that don't appear on my map. And when I'm on the descent route above Williams River, I don't look to the left, because I'm afraid of what I might see. I'm afraid the trail will be there again, worn and waiting, with its cairns pointing inward toward a hollow where 12 chairs sit in a circle and the moss is trampled with the footprints of barefoot people who walk in patterns. I don't want to understand, and I'm afraid that if I follow it again, the trail won't just close behind me. I'm afraid I'll reach that clearing and the chairs won't be empty. I'll reach it at the wrong time, on the wrong night, and I'll find the 12 people sitting there, watching each other, doing whatever they do in that hidden place when no one else is watching. My grandfather built that cabin in 1961 with wood he cut and milled himself from trees that grew on the same hollow where the structure would stand. He was that kind of man, the kind who believed that a thing ought to come from the place where it would live, that there was a rightness to building a house from the bones of the land it sat on. The cabin was simple, one room with a sleeping loft, a wood stove made from a 50-gallon drum, a porch that ran the length of the front wall and looked out over the hollow as it fell away toward the creek at the bottom. Behind the cabin, the ridge rose at an angle that bordered on vertical, a wall of rock and old-growth timber that climbed maybe 800 feet to a knife-edge summit that you could see from town on clear days. Nobody went up that ridge. There was no trail, no game path, no reason to attempt a climb that would challenge a person with ropes and experience in daylight and would be suicidal in the dark. The ridge was a wall at the back of our property, a boundary between the hollow where we hunted and whatever lay on the other side, and in 30 years of visiting that cabin, I'd never given much thought to what was up there. It was just the ridge. It was just the back wall of the world as I knew it. My brother Cole and I started going up there together after our grandfather died in 2007. We'd been going with him since we were boys, learning to hunt, learning to read the woods, learning the particular rhythms of a week spent in the mountains with no electricity and no running water and no connection to the outside world except a logging road that wound 4 miles down to the county blacktop. After he was gone, we kept the tradition. First week of November, every year, no exceptions. Cole would drive up from Morgantown where he worked construction, and I'd come from Elkins where I taught high school biology, and we'd spend the week the way our grandfather had taught us, hunting during the day, sitting on the porch at night, talking about whatever needed talking about, or sitting in comfortable silence when nothing did. The cabin was our inheritance, not just the building but the ritual, the pattern of days, the understanding that some places hold you in ways that have nothing to do with ownership and everything to do with belonging. November 2019. We arrived on a Sunday afternoon, unloaded the truck, split enough wood to get us through the week, and settled in. The weather was cold but clear, the kind of early November that promises frost at night and 45 degrees during the day, good hunting weather, the deer moving in the chill. Monday and Tuesday were normal. We hunted, we ate, we sat on the porch after dark with bourbon and watched the hollow fill up with night the way a bowl fills with water, the darkness rising from the creek bottom and climbing the slopes until only the ridgeline was visible against the sky. And then that too was gone, and the world was just sound and cold, and the orange glow of the wood stove through the cabin windows behind us. Wednesday night was different. We'd had a good day. Cole had taken a 6-point buck from a stand overlooking a trail that crossed the creek, a clean shot through the lungs at maybe 80 yards, and we'd spent the afternoon dressing it and hanging it from the meat pole behind the cabin. We were in good spirits, sitting on the porch around 8 o'clock, the temperature dropping into the mid-20s, the sky clear enough that the stars were thick and bright through the bare branches overhead. The hollow was quiet in the way it always was at night, not silent but settled, the creek audible at the bottom, an occasional owl, the small sounds of the forest doing its nighttime business. Normal sounds, expected sounds, the sounds I'd been hearing at this cabin since I was 6 years old. The scream came at 8:47. I know the time because I checked my watch afterward, wanting to fix the moment, to anchor it to something concrete and measurable. It came from the ridge behind the cabin, from somewhere high on that near vertical slope, and it was a woman's voice, and it was screaming. I need to be specific about what I mean when I say it was human. I've spent my adult life in these mountains. I've heard bobcats in breeding season, which is a sound that will stand the hair up on your neck if you don't know what it is, a ragged, shrieking cry that sounds like a woman being murdered. I've heard red foxes barking, which can sound like a person shouting for help. I've heard barred owls doing their full repertoire, including the caterwauling calls that have sent more than one inexperienced hiker running for their car. I know these sounds. I can identify them in my sleep. What came off that ridge was none of them. It was a human voice, female, screaming at a pitch and duration that communicated pure terror, the kind of scream that comes from someone who is seeing something so terrible that the body bypasses language entirely and goes straight to the most primitive sound it can produce. It lasted maybe 4 seconds. It echoed off the walls of the hollow, bouncing between the slopes, and then it stopped, and the silence that replaced it was so absolute that the creek at the bottom of the hollow seemed to go quiet, as if even the water was listening. Cole and I were on our feet. We'd both stood at the same instant, the way you stand when a sound reaches past your conscious mind and triggers the older systems, the ones that don't wait for analysis. We were standing on the porch in the dark, staring up at the ridge, and I could feel my heart in my throat, and my hands had gone cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. Cole said, "Did you hear that?" And I said yes, and he said that was a person, and I said yes. Cole is 3 years younger than me, and he's always been the one who moves first and thinks second. Before I could say anything else, before I could suggest we go inside and get a flashlight or a rifle or our phones, he cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted up at the ridge, "Hello, are you okay? Do you need help?" His voice was loud in the silence, a solid baritone that I'm sure carried well up the slope. The words bounced off the rock face and came back to us diminished, and then there was silence again. Deep, heavy silence, the kind that has texture, the kind you can feel pressing against your skin. 10 seconds. 15. I was about to tell Cole we should call the sheriff, should try to get a signal on the logging road, when the scream came again. Same voice, same pitch, same duration, same raw, terrified quality. But it wasn't coming from where it had come from before. The first scream had originated from high on the ridge, maybe 500 feet up and slightly to the north. This one came from a point maybe 300 yards south along the ridge face, at roughly the same elevation. As if the woman who had screamed had covered 300 yards of impassable terrain in 15 seconds of silence. As if she'd been picked up and set down in a new location. Or as if the sound itself had moved, detaching from its source and relocating to a new position, the way a ventriloquist throws a voice across a room. Cole shouted again. "Where are you? We can help. Tell us where you are." His voice carried up into the dark, and the echo came back, and the silence settled, and I grabbed his arm and said, "Stop, don't shout again, something is wrong." He looked at me, and in the starlight I could see his face, and he looked the way I felt, which was scared in a way that didn't have a name, scared at a level below the conscious mind where the body knows things the brain hasn't figured out yet. The scream came a third time, closer, not from the high ridge now, but from midway down the slope, maybe 200 yards behind the cabin, at a point where the grade was still too steep for any person to stand without climbing equipment. Same voice, same scream, identical in every respect to the first two, as if it had been recorded and was being played back from a speaker that was moving down the mountain toward us. And this time, when it ended, I heard something else. In the silence after the scream, in that heavy, breathless pause, I heard movement on the slope. Not the careful movement of a person picking their way down a steep grade, not the crashing of a deer or a bear, something else. A sliding, scraping sound, like a heavy weight being dragged across rock and loose soil, and it was coming downhill. Toward the cabin. Cole heard it too. He stepped back from the porch railing, and I stepped back with him, and we both stood there in the dark, listening to something descend the ridge behind our grandfather's cabin, with a sound that didn't match anything either of us had heard in a combined 50 years in these mountains. The sliding continued for maybe 30 seconds, accompanied by the occasional crack of a branch or the clatter of dislodged stones tumbling down the slope, and then it stopped. The silence returned. We stood on the porch and stared at the dark wall of forest behind the cabin, and the dark slope rising above it, and nothing moved, and nothing made a sound, and the night was so quiet I could hear Cole's breathing beside me, rapid and shallow. I wanted to go inside. Every instinct I had was telling me to get inside the cabin, to close the door, to put a wall between us and whatever was on that slope. But I couldn't move, and Cole couldn't move, and we stood there like animals in a spotlight, frozen by a fear that was so fundamental it overrode the conscious mind's ability to generate action. Cole spoke. I don't know why, maybe for the same reason he'd shouted before, some deep-seated need to assert human presence in the face of something that felt profoundly inhuman. He didn't shout this time. He just said, in a normal conversational voice, as if he were talking to someone standing in the yard, "Who's there?" The scream answered him, from the tree line, 50 yards from the porch. The same scream, the same woman's voice, the same pitch and duration and terror, but so close now that I could feel it in my chest, could feel the sound waves hitting my body like a physical force. It was coming from just inside the trees at the base of the ridge, from a spot I could have walked to in 30 seconds, from the darkness where the forest met the cleared ground around the cabin. And then it changed. The scream modulated, shifted, dropped in pitch, and for just a moment, before it cut off, it sounded like Cole's voice. Not the words he'd said, but the timbre, the resonance, the specific quality of his vocal cords reproduced in a scream that had started female and ended as something else, something that was trying on his voice the way you'd try on a coat, testing the fit. We went inside. We went inside fast, both of us through the door at the same time, and Cole slammed it shut and threw the bolt, and I grabbed the rifle from the rack, and we stood in the middle of our grandfather's cabin in the orange light of the wood stove and looked at each other, and neither of us spoke because there were no words for what we'd just heard. We didn't sleep. We sat up all night with the rifle across Cole's knees and the wood stove burning hot and every lamp and candle in the cabin lit, filling the room with a warm, bright light that didn't reach the windows, that stopped at the glass and showed us nothing but our own reflections against the darkness outside. We heard nothing more. No screams, no sliding sounds, no movement. The hollow settled back into its normal nighttime quiet, the creek murmuring, the occasional owl, the small sounds that belonged there. Whatever had been on the ridge, whatever had descended toward us, whatever had mimicked my brother's voice from the tree line, it was gone, or it was quiet, or it was waiting. We left at first light. Neither of us suggested staying. We packed in 20 minutes, loaded the truck, and drove down the logging road without speaking. We didn't discuss it until we reached the county blacktop, and even then the conversation was brief and inadequate. Cole said, "What was that?" And I said, "I don't know," and he said it was copying me. And I said, "I know," and he said I shouldn't have shouted, and I said, "I know," and that was the end of it. We drove our separate directions and went home and didn't call each other for 3 days, which was unusual for us, which was a measure of how deeply the experience had shaken something that we didn't know how to repair with words. I went back to the cabin the following spring, alone, in daylight. I told myself I was checking on the property, making sure the roof had held through winter, the usual maintenance. But really, I went back because I needed to see the ridge in the light, needed to see the slope behind the cabin and the tree line and the rocky face above, and confirm that it was just a mountain, just rock and trees and soil, just the back wall of the hollow that I'd known my whole life. I walked the tree line where the last scream had originated. The ground was soft from spring thaw, and I looked for tracks, for any sign that something had been there. I found marks on the slope, not tracks exactly, but disturbances in the soil and leaf litter, long scraping furrows that ran downhill in parallel lines, as if something heavy had slid down the grade, dragging through the debris. The furrows were old, softened by months of weather, but they were there. They ran from high on the ridge, from a point I couldn't see, down to the tree line behind the cabin, where they ended in a patch of disturbed ground maybe 50 yards from the porch. From that spot, the cabin was clearly visible through the bare winter trees. Whatever had made those marks had come down the ridge and stopped at a point with a clear line of sight to where Cole and I had been standing. I haven't told Cole about the marks. We still go to the cabin every November, and we still sit on the porch at night, and we still listen to the hollow settle into darkness. But we don't shout. We don't call out to sounds we can't explain. We don't answer things that scream from the ridge in the dark. We sit quietly and we listen, and when a sound comes that we can't identify, we go inside and close the door and wait for morning. Because I think Cole was right. It was using his voice to find us. Each time he shouted, it answered from a position closer to the source of his voice, triangulating, narrowing the distance, and when it reached the tree line, it had learned enough about the sound of him to begin reproducing it. And I think if he'd shouted one more time, if he'd given it one more sample to work with, it would have gotten the voice right. It would have stood in those trees and spoken in a perfect reproduction of my brother's voice, saying words he'd never said, calling to me from the dark in a voice I trusted. And I think I would have gone to it. I think the whole point was to make me go to it, to call out in a voice I recognized, from a distance I could cross, and to wait for me to step off the porch and walk into the trees where the scrape marks ended and the darkness began. I don't know what it was. I don't know where it went. I don't know if it's still on that ridge, listening, waiting for the next voice to answer back, the next sound to triangulate on, the next person foolish enough to shout into the dark and wait for a response. But I know this. In these mountains, when something screams in the night, you don't answer, you don't call out, you don't give it your voice, because something might be listening, something that learns, something that practices, something that waits on a ridge so steep no person could stand on it, mimicking sounds it has collected, getting better with each repetition, patient and precise and utterly, terrifyingly close. And the next time it calls, it might sound like someone you know. It might sound like someone you love. It might use your brother's voice, your mother's voice, your own voice, calling you by name from just beyond the tree line, asking you to come closer, telling you everything is fine. And if you go, I don't think you come back. I think you join the collection. I think your voice becomes the next one it practices with, the next one it sends down from the ridge on a cold November night, testing it, refining it, waiting for someone to answer. So I don't answer anymore. And when Cole and I sit on that porch in the dark, and the hollow goes quiet, and the ridge looms behind us like a wall of black stone against a blacker sky, we keep our voices low and our words to each other, and we let the mountain keep whatever secrets it holds. Because some things in these woods aren't asking for help when they scream, they're hunting. And the bait is your own need to respond, your own human compulsion to answer a cry of distress, to call back into the darkness and say, I'm here, tell me where you are. Don't tell it where you are. That's the only. I've been running coonhounds in the mountains of eastern Kentucky since I was 14 years old, which means I've spent the better part of 34 years following dogs through terrain that most people wouldn't walk in daylight, let alone at night with nothing but a headlamp and a .22 pistol and the sound of hounds working a trail ahead of you in the dark. My father taught me, same as his father taught him, and the knowledge goes back further than that, back to a time when running hounds wasn't a hobby but a necessity, when a family's ability to put meat on the table depended on dogs that could track and tree and hold in country so rough and remote that it might as well have been the surface of another planet. I tell people that I know these mountains, and they think I mean I've hiked them, that I've driven the roads and pulled off at the overlooks and taken pictures. That's not what I mean. I mean I've crawled through laurel thickets in the dark on my hands and knees following the sound of a dog that's treed half a mile up a ridgeline with no trail. I mean I've waded creeks in November when the water was cold enough to stop your heart and climbed rock faces by feel because the headlamp died and the dog was still running and you don't leave your dog. I know these mountains the way a miner knows the inside of a shaft, by feel, by sound, by the particular quality of darkness in each hollow and on each ridge, because darkness is not the same everywhere, and anyone who tells you otherwise hasn't spent enough time in it. The dogs know the mountains better than I do. That's not false modesty. A coonhound operates in a world of scent that humans can barely imagine, a world where every square foot of ground holds information, where the passage of a raccoon 3 hours ago leaves a trail as vivid and readable to them as a highway is to us. My dogs could track through water, through rock, through terrain so dense I'd lose them for hours before they'd come back to me, tongues hanging, tails working, ready to go again. They were bred for it. Generations of selective breeding had produced animals that were born to pursue and would do so through any condition, across any terrain, in any weather. Fear wasn't part of their vocabulary. They'd run through thorn bushes that shredded their ears, swim rivers that would drown a man, confront bears and bobcats with nothing but their voice and their courage. In 20 years of running hounds, through hundreds of nights in some of the wildest country in Appalachia, I had never once seen a dog refuse to track, until Jessup Hollow. I need to tell you about the hollow before I tell you what happened, because the place matters. Everything in these mountains is about place, about the specific character of a particular piece of ground, and Jessup Hollow has a character that I'd been aware of long before that night in October. It sits about 6 miles southeast of Hindman in Knott County, a deep crease in the mountains where two ridges come together at a narrow angle and a creek runs between them before emptying into Troublesome Creek at the bottom. The hollow is maybe 1.5 miles long, steep-sided, heavily timbered with old hemlock and poplar that block the sky so thoroughly that the floor of the hollow exists in a permanent twilight even at noon. There's no road into it. There used to be a footpath that the old families used. The people who lived up those hollows before the modern world made that kind of isolation unnecessary, but it's been grown over for decades. The only reliable way in is to follow the creek from its mouth, walking the creek bed itself because the banks are too choked with rhododendron to navigate. People in Knott County don't go into Jessup Hollow. That's not an exaggeration or a simplification. There's a general understanding, never formally stated, never written down, never taught as a lesson, but absorbed the way children absorb the unspoken rules of any community, that Jessup Hollow is a place you leave alone. If you ask people why, you get different answers. Some say the terrain is too rough, that there's nothing in there worth the effort of getting to it. Some say the old families who lived there were strange people who didn't want visitors and that the hollow inherited their temperament. A few, if they trust you, if they've had enough to drink, will tell you that there's something in Jessup Hollow that doesn't belong there, something that's been there for a long time, and that the smartest thing you can do is stay out and let it have its space. I'd run dogs near the hollow before, along the ridges on either side, and along Troublesome Creek below its mouth. I'd never had a problem. The dogs worked those areas the same as they worked anywhere else, noses down, tails up, doing what they were bred to do. But I'd never gone into the hollow itself, partly because the terrain was genuinely difficult, and partly because I'd absorbed enough of the local caution to give it a wide berth without examining too closely why I was doing so. October 2018. I was training a young redbone named Dutch, a 16-month-old male with a nose so good it almost seemed unfair to the raccoons. I'd been working him for about 4 months, mostly on short runs in familiar territory, building his stamina and his confidence and his ability to stay on a track when the scent got complicated. He was coming along beautifully. He had that rare combination of drive and intelligence that separates a good hound from a great one, the kind of dog that doesn't just follow a trail but reads it, interpreting the scent the way a musician reads a score, understanding not just where the animal went, but when and how fast, and whether it was calm or frightened. Dutch was special, and I was running him that night with 2 older dogs, a blue tick named Cora and a walker named Hatchet, both experienced and steady, the kind of dogs you pair with a young one to show him how the work is done. We started around 9 o'clock on a Friday night, working a ridge about a mile north of Jessup Hollow. The conditions were good, cool, damp, a light breeze from the southwest that would carry scent up the slopes. Within 20 minutes, Dutch struck a trail, a hot track that had him baying with a voice that echoed off the ridges and made the hair on my arms stand up with the pure beauty of the sound. Cora and Hatchet joined in, and the 3 of them took off down the ridge, running hard, the sound of their voices telling me everything I needed to know about the quality of the track and the direction of the pursuit. I followed by headlamp, moving as fast as the terrain allowed, listening to the dogs work. They dropped off the ridge and into a creek drainage, the baying echoing off the steep walls of the little valley, and I scrambled down after them, sliding on loose shale, grabbing saplings to control my descent. The creek at the bottom was small, ankle-deep, running south toward Troublesome Creek. The dogs were ahead of me, maybe 300 yards, and from the sound of their voices I could tell the coon had turned south along the creek bed, heading downstream. I followed the creek for maybe 20 minutes, listening to the chase unfold ahead of me, and gradually I became aware of where I was. The ridges on either side were getting steeper, closing in, the creek narrowing as the valley tightened. The hemlock canopy overhead was blocking the sky, and the air had that particular quality, damp and still and heavy, that I associated with deep hollows where the sun rarely reached. I checked my GPS. I was at the mouth of Jessup Hollow. The creek I was following was the creek that ran through it, and my dogs were ahead of me, running their tracks straight into the place that everyone in Knott County knew enough to avoid. I picked up my pace, wanting to get to the dogs before they went too deep. The baying was still strong, still moving south, the coon running the creek bed with the dogs in full pursuit. Then, about 5 minutes later, the sound changed. It didn't diminish the way it does when dogs lose a track or tree an animal. It stopped. All 3 dogs, in full cry one moment, silent the next, as if someone had hit a switch. In 20 years of running hounds, I'd never heard anything like it. Dogs don't go from full baying to total silence. They slow down, they cast around, they lose the track and start searching. They don't just stop. I ran. I crashed down that creek bed with no regard for the terrain, slipping on wet rocks, soaking my boots, branches whipping my face, and I ran until I found them. All 3 dogs were standing in the creek bed at the point where the hollow narrowed between the 2 ridges, where the water flowed between banks so steep and overgrown that the space above the creek was a tunnel of rhododendron and hemlock. Dutch was in front. He was planted, all 4 feet set wide on the creek rocks, his body rigid, his tail tucked so tight against his belly it might as well have been gone. His hackles were up, a ridge of raised fur running from his skull to his tail base, and he was shaking. Not shivering from cold, but trembling, a fine, rapid vibration that ran through his whole body like a current. He was making a sound I'd never heard from a hound in 20 years. A whine, but not the whine of a dog that's hurt or anxious. This was deeper, more guttural, a continuous low vocalization that came from his chest and vibrated in his throat and sounded less like a dog and more like something fundamental, something that existed below language, below species, in the territory of pure biological alarm. I brought Cora and Hatchet up. They'd stopped behind Dutch, both of them showing the same signs, hackles raised, trembling, that deep chest whine. Cora, who'd treed bears, who'd chased a bobcat up a cliff face and stood at the bottom, baying for 2 hours, was shaking so hard her collar was rattling. Hatchet, 7 years old and the steadiest dog I'd ever owned, had his tail between his legs and was leaning against my calf, pressing his body against me the way a frightened child presses against a parent. All 3 of them were staring into the hollow, into the darkness where the creek disappeared between the ridges, where the hemlock canopy closed like a fist, and the rhododendron formed walls so thick you couldn't see 5 feet into them. They were staring, and they were terrified, and every instinct that 100 generations of breeding had given them, the drive, the courage, the relentless pursuit, all of it was overridden by something more fundamental, something older than breeding, older than domestication, something that lived in the deepest part of their animal brains and was screaming at them to not go forward. I stood there in the creek bed with my 3 dogs trembling against me, and I looked into Jessup Hollow, and I tried to see what they were seeing, or smelling. Whatever had stopped them, it wasn't visual. The hollow was too dark and too dense for any of us to see more than a few yards into it. It was scent. Something in that hollow was producing a scent that my dogs could read and I couldn't. A chemical message carried on the damp air that said danger in a language older than human speech, and whatever was producing that scent was terrible enough to stop 3 coonhounds in full pursuit and reduce them to shaking, whining animals that wanted nothing more than to leave. I tried to move Dutch forward, not aggressively, just a gentle pressure on the leash, a verbal encouragement, the kind of handling that had always been enough to push a hesitant dog past a moment of uncertainty. He wouldn't move. He planted his feet and leaned back against the leash, and the whine in his chest increased in pitch and volume, and his eyes were showing white, and I realized with a sudden, visceral certainty that if I forced this dog into that hollow, he would break, not physically but mentally. Whatever was in there would damage something in him that couldn't be repaired, would destroy the thing that made him a hound, the courage and the drive and the joy of the chase, and he would never be the same dog again. I stopped pulling. I stood in the creek bed in the dark with my headlamp making a small circle of light on the water, and I listened. The hollow was quiet. Not just quiet, silent, the way a room is silent when someone is holding their breath. No water sounds from upstream, though the creek clearly continued into the hollow. No insects, no owl, no rustling, no wind in the canopy. The silence had a pressure to it, a density, as if the air in the hollow was heavier than the air around it, as if something was compressing the atmosphere at the entrance, the way a hand compresses a sponge. And then I smelled it. Just for a moment, just a trace, carried on a thread of air that drifted out of the hollow like breath from a sleeping mouth. It was organic, complex, unlike anything I could name. Not decay exactly, though decay was part of it. Not musk, though there was a musky quality. It was layered, dense, a smell that seemed to contain information the way the dog's scent world contained information. And although I couldn't read it the way they could, I understood enough. I understood that something was in that hollow that was alive and large and very close, and that it was aware of us in the same way we were aware of it, and that the smell was not incidental but intentional, a warning, a territorial marker, a message that said this place is mine and you are not welcome, and if you come further, you will learn why. I turned around. I picked up Dutch's leash and Cora's leash and Hatchet's leash, and I turned my back on Jessup Hollow, and I walked down the creek bed the way I'd come, and the dogs came with me willingly, eagerly, pulling ahead of me in their haste to put distance between themselves and whatever they'd smelled. We walked in silence for a long time, the dogs gradually settling, the trembling subsiding, the whining fading as the hollow fell behind us. By the time we reached Troublesome Creek, maybe half a mile downstream, they were almost normal again. Almost. Dutch kept looking back, checking behind us, ears swiveling, and he did that for the rest of the night. I talked to people afterward, carefully, indirectly, the way you ask about things in these mountains when you're not sure you want the answers. I talked to an old man named Elmer Stacy who'd lived within a mile of Jessop Hollow his entire life, 87 years, and who told me his father had warned him about the hollow when he was a boy, and his grandfather had warned his father before that. He said the hollow had always been wrong. He said animals avoided it, not just dogs, but deer, bear, turkeys, everything with legs and the sense to use them. He said the creek that ran through it was dead water, no fish, no crayfish, no salamanders, nothing living in it from the mouth of the hollow upstream. He said people had gone in over the years, a few, and most of them came back and didn't talk about what they'd found, and the ones who did talk said things that didn't make sense, things about the trees being wrong and the ground being wrong and the air being wrong in ways they couldn't describe because the English language doesn't have words for a place that is fundamentally, structurally incorrect. He said one man didn't come back, a logger in the 1940s who'd gone in to scout timber and was found 3 days later sitting on a rock at the mouth of the hollow, alive but empty, staring at nothing, unable to speak or feed himself or do anything except sit and stare at the place he'd come from. He never spoke again. He died in a state hospital in Lexington in 1953. I don't go near Jessop Hollow anymore. I run my dogs on other ridges, in other hollows, in places where the forest is just a forest, and the darkness is just the absence of light, and the things that live in the woods are things I can name and understand. Dutch is 8 now, getting gray around the muzzle, still the best nose I've ever worked with. He'll run anything, anywhere, through any terrain and any conditions, fearless and driven and joyful in the way that only a dog doing exactly what it was born to do can be joyful. Except he won't go south of that ridge. He knows where the hollow is, the way a compass knows where north is, by some internal orientation that doesn't require sight or memory, and if I take him anywhere within a mile of it, he stops and sits and looks at me with those brown eyes and waits for me to make the right decision. And I always do. I turn around and we go somewhere else, and I don't look back, and I don't think about what's sitting in that hollow in the dark, producing a scent that 3 coonhounds could read like a death sentence, patient and permanent and utterly, absolutely certain that it will never be disturbed, because the dogs know, they've always known. I've been doing search and rescue in the Allegheny Highlands of West Virginia for 11 years, which means I've seen most of the ways people come apart in the backcountry. I've carried out hikers who fell from ridge lines and broke themselves on the rocks below. I've found hunters who wandered off their stands and got turned around in hollows so deep the compass spun and the GPS bounced off 3 different satellites and still couldn't figure out where it was. I've recovered drowning victims from rivers that look calm on the surface and held undertows that could pin a grown man against a submerged log until his lungs filled. The work has a rhythm to it, a grim but predictable cycle of alarm and search and discovery, and even when the discovery is terrible, and it often is, there's usually an explanation that fits inside the boundaries of what I understand about people and mountains and the ways they interact. People make mistakes. The terrain punishes mistakes. The outcome is tragedy, but not mystery. I can live with tragedy. What I can't live with, what sits in my chest like a stone I swallow every morning and carry all day, is mystery. And the campsite we found in Dolly Sods in August of 2022 is the purest mystery I've ever encountered. A thing that defies every explanation I've tried to build around it and sits there in my memory, intact and impossible, refusing to become anything other than exactly what it was. The call came on a Tuesday morning. A family of 4, the Harpers from Northern Virginia, were 2 days overdue from a backcountry camping trip in the Dolly Sods wilderness. The father, Craig, had filed a trip plan with the ranger station 3 nights in the backcountry, entering from the Bear Rocks trailhead, camping near Red Creek, exiting on Monday. It was now Tuesday, and they hadn't come out and weren't answering their phones, which meant nothing in Dolly Sods where cell coverage is a fantasy, but the family waiting for them back in Fairfax was worried, and the Rangers were taking it seriously. Craig was 44. His wife Melissa was 41. Their kids, a boy named Tyler and a girl named Sophia, were 16 and 14. Experienced campers, according to the trip plan. Proper gear, good physical condition. The kind of family that knew what they were doing in the backcountry, which made the overdue status more concerning, not less, because experienced people don't usually just lose track of time. We assembled a team of 8 and entered from Bare Rocks on Tuesday afternoon, following the route Craig had listed on his trip plan. Dolly Sods is strange country, even by Appalachian standards, a high-elevation plateau that looks more like the Canadian tundra than West Virginia, with open heath barrens and wind-stunted spruce and bogs that can swallow you to the waist if you step wrong. The terrain is disorienting. The trails are poorly marked. The weather changes fast, fog rolling in from the Allegheny front with no warning, reducing visibility to 20 feet in minutes. People get lost up there regularly, and most of them are found within a day, sheepish and dehydrated but alive. I expected this to be one of those. A family that took a wrong turn ended up in one of the drainages, where the trails peter out, maybe a twisted ankle or a case of mild hypothermia, keeping them from hiking out on their own. Standard stuff, routine. We found the campsite on Wednesday morning, the second day of searching. It was in a clearing about 200 yards from Red Creek, on a flat bench of ground shaded by a stand of red spruce that grew in a rough semicircle, creating a natural windbreak. The campsite was visible from maybe 50 yards out, and the first thing I noticed was how orderly it was. 2 tents, a larger 4-person and a smaller 2-person, pitched side by side on level ground, properly staked with the rainflies taut and the guy lines pegged at the correct angles. The site was textbook, the kind of setup you'd see in a camping manual, everything done right, everything in its place. We approached carefully, calling out as we came, identifying ourselves as search and rescue. No response. The camp was silent, the tent still, no movement anywhere. I reached the larger tent first and unzipped the door and looked inside. 2 sleeping bags were laid out on foam pads, unzipped and open, the way you'd leave them if you'd just gotten up in the morning and hadn't bothered to roll them. A stuffed sack with clothing sat in the corner. 2 headlamps hung from the tent's interior loop. A paperback novel lay face down near one of the pads. Everything was dry. Everything was clean. Everything was arranged with the particular neatness of people who keep an orderly camp. The tent smelled like nylon and bug spray, and the faint human smell of people who've been sleeping in close quarters. It smelled occupied. It smelled like people had been there recently and had simply stepped out. The second tent was the same. 2 sleeping bags, open and flat, personal items arranged neatly, a phone charging from a portable battery pack, the screen dark, a journal with a pen clipped to the cover. The kids' tent, clearly, from the younger-looking gear and the phone. Outside, the campsite told the same story of orderly habitation interrupted mid-moment. A bear bag hung from a tree branch, properly rigged on a cord thrown over a high limb, containing what we later inventoried as 3 days' worth of food for 4 people, properly packed in sealed bags. A camp stove sat on a flat rock near the fire ring, and on it was a pot. The pot had contained water at some point. The stove's fuel canister was empty, completely spent, which meant the stove had been burning until the fuel ran out. The water had boiled away, and the bottom of the pot was scorched black, the metal discolored from sustained dry heat. Someone had put water on to boil, and then never come back to tend it, and the stove had burned until there was nothing left to burn. 4 pairs of hiking boots sat outside the tent doors, 2 large pairs, 2 smaller, arranged neatly on the ground cloth, laces loosened, the way you'd leave them if you were stepping out of your tent in the morning and planned to put them on in a moment. Socks were tucked inside each pair. I looked at those boots for a long time. 4 people had taken off their boots and socks and placed them carefully outside their tents, and then walked away from the campsite barefoot into terrain that included rocks and roots and thorns, and the general hostility of a wilderness floor that punishes unprotected feet. They'd done it deliberately, not in panic, not in haste. The boots were too neatly arranged for panic. Each pair was side by side, aligned with the tent door, socks rolled and tucked inside. This was methodical. This was chosen. And then there were the footprints. The ground around the campsite was soft from recent rain, a dark, peaty soil that held impressions clearly, and it was covered in footprints, bare footprints, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, layered on top of each other in patterns that I spent the better part of an hour trying to understand, and couldn't. There were 4 distinct sizes, consistent with 2 adults and 2 teenagers, and they were everywhere. They circled the tents in tight loops, They traced figure eights between the two tents and the fire ring. They crossed and recrossed each other in paths that wound through the campsite in patterns that looked deliberate, that looked choreographed, as if four people had been walking in synchronized formations around their own camp for hours. I've tracked people through wilderness for over a decade. I can read footprints the way Dutch reads scent, extracting information about speed and direction and the physical state of the person who made them. These prints told me things that didn't make sense. The stride length was consistent throughout, not the shortening stride of someone who's tired or the lengthening stride of someone who's frightened. The depth was even, suggesting a steady, unhurried pace. There was no scuffing, no stumbling, no indication that the people making these prints were doing anything other than walking calmly and deliberately in patterns that would have taken hours to produce. And the patterns themselves, the circles and the figure eights and the crossing paths, had a regularity that made my skin crawl. They weren't random. They weren't the wandering tracks of confused or disoriented people. They were precise, repeated, intentional. Four people walking barefoot in the dark, around and around their campsite, tracing shapes in the dirt with the focused concentration of a ritual. The prints led away from the campsite in a single file line heading northwest, toward the drainage that dropped off the plateau into the canyon below. Four sets of bare feet, one behind the other, spaced evenly, walking away from their boots and their gear and their food and their shelter into the backcountry with nothing on their feet and, as far as we could tell, nothing in their hands. We followed the trail for about a quarter mile before it reached a section of exposed rock where the prints disappeared. Beyond the rock, the terrain dropped steeply into a drainage, choked with rhododendron and laurel, dense enough to stop a person and rough enough to shred bare feet within 100 yards. We searched for 6 days, 42 people at peak deployment, including dog teams, a helicopter with thermal imaging, and volunteers from 3 counties. We covered every drainage, every ridge, every square yard of wilderness within a 5-mile radius of that campsite. We found nothing. No clothing, no tracks beyond the rock shelf, no disturbance in the vegetation, no sign that 4 barefoot people had passed through any of the terrain surrounding the camp. The dogs were useless. They'd pick up scent at the campsite, follow it to the rock shelf, and lose it. Every dog, every handler, same result. The scent trail ended on the rock, as if the Harpers had walked to that point and evaporated. The investigation that followed turned up nothing useful. Craig's trip plan was accurate. Their car was at the Bear Rocks trailhead, locked, undisturbed. Their credit cards showed no activity after the day they'd entered the wilderness. Their phones, recovered from the tents, showed no calls or texts after the first evening, when Melissa had texted her sister a photo of the sunset with the message, "Paradise." The phone batteries were nearly dead. The journal in the kids' tent had entries for 2 days, normal entries, descriptions of the hike and the scenery and the wildlife they'd seen. The last entry was dated the second evening, written by Sophia in neat handwriting, and it ended with, "Dad says he heard something weird last night, but Mom thinks it was an owl. Going to bed early, tired from hiking. Tomorrow, we explore the creek." That entry, that last line, "Tomorrow we explore the creek," written by a 14-year-old girl who went to sleep in her tent with plans for the next day, and at some point during the night took off her boots and her socks and walked barefoot in circles around her campsite with her family, and then walked away into the wilderness and was never seen. Again, the case is still open. Officially, they're missing persons, which is a designation that allows the file to remain active indefinitely, which means someone somewhere is technically still looking for the Harpers, is still waiting for a phone call or a sighting or a piece of evidence that breaks the case open and provides the explanation that 11 years of search and rescue experience tells me should exist, but doesn't. I go back to Dolly Sod sometimes, not to the campsite, which I couldn't find again without GPS coordinates and don't want to find again even with them, but to the plateau, to the heath barrens and the windswept spruce and the bogs where the mist comes in like something alive. I go because the mountains are still the mountains, still the place I've given my professional life to, and I refuse to let one mystery drive me away from country I love. But I don't camp there anymore. I go in daylight and I come out before dark, and when the fog rolls in I leave, because the fog makes me think of 4 people walking in circles in the dark, and I can't let that thought take hold, because once it does, it doesn't let go. What happened to the Harpers? I don't know. Nobody knows. The footprints say they walked away voluntarily, calmly, without their shoes, in the middle of the night after performing some kind of repetitive synchronized movement around their camp that lasted for hours. The evidence says they chose this, whatever this was. And that's the part that keeps me up. Not the disappearance itself, but the choice, the deliberateness of it, the boots placed neatly outside the tents, the patterns in the dirt, the single file walk into the drainage, and the silence that followed. Something happened at that campsite between the time Sophia wrote her last journal entry and the time the stove fuel ran out. Something that made 4 rational, experienced people take off their shoes and walk into the wilderness and not come back. And whatever it was, it didn't leave a mark on anything except the soft ground around 2 empty tents and a pot that boiled dry on a stove that nobody was watching anymore. I think about Sophia's journal entry every day. Tomorrow we explore the creek. She had plans. She had tomorrow. And then something took tomorrow away from her. Quietly, methodically, in patterns pressed into the dirt by bare feet walking. I've worked as a land surveyor in southwestern Virginia for 9 years, which is long enough to have developed a comfort with solitude that most people would find uncomfortable. The work demands it. You spend days at a time in places that haven't seen a human footprint in years, walking property lines through terrain that's been left to the slow reclamation of the forest, carrying your equipment through hollows and up ridges that the maps show as blank green space with no roads, no structures, no indication that anyone ever lived or worked there. But they did. That's the thing about this part of Virginia, this corner of Appalachia where the coalfields bleed into the mountains, and the mountains hold the evidence of a century of extraction in their scarred slopes and abandoned workings. People were everywhere up here once. They cut the timber and dug the coal and built towns in hollows that are now nothing but foundation stones and chimney stacks, and the occasional piece of rusted equipment so overgrown you'd walk past it without noticing. The land has been taking it all back, slowly, patiently, covering the wounds with new growth, the way skin covers a scar. And my job often puts me in places where that process is still underway, where the human past and the natural present exist in an uneasy overlap that you can feel in the quality of the silence and the way the forest grows differently over disturbed ground. March of 2020, I was surveying a property boundary about 2 miles south of Breaks Interstate Park, working a parcel that a timber company was considering for acquisition. The property was remote, even by my standards, accessible only by a Forest Service road that dead-ended at a turnaround, where the mountain got too steep for vehicles, followed by a 2-mile hike up a drainage to the boundary line I needed to mark. The terrain was typical for the area. Steep, heavily wooded, cut through with small creeks and rock outcroppings, the understory thick with rhododendron and mountain laurel that made cross-country travel a constant negotiation with vegetation that didn't want you there. I was working the southern boundary, shooting points with my GPS and flagging the line with orange ribbon, when I found the mine entrance. It was in the face of a rock outcropping about 30 feet above the creek, partially hidden by a stand of hemlock that had grown up around it in the decades since anyone had last been there. The entrance was a horizontal bore, maybe 5 feet high and 4 feet wide, cut into the sandstone with the rough precision of hand drilling and blasting. The timber frame that had once supported the entrance had partially collapsed, the header beam cracked and sagging, the side posts leaning inward, but the opening was still passable. You could have walked in if you were willing to duck under the broken header, which I was not, because abandoned mines are death traps and I've been trained to stay out of them. But I stood at the entrance and looked in, because you always look in. The bore extended straight into the mountain for as far as my flashlight could reach, maybe 40 or 50 feet of visible tunnel, before the beam lost itself in darkness. The walls were rough-cut rock, the floor covered in a layer of debris, fallen stone, rotted timber, the accumulated detritus of 70 years of abandonment. Rails were visible under the debris, the narrow-gauge track that the coal cars had run on, rusted to a dark brown that was almost black. Water seeped from the walls and collected in puddles on the floor, and the air coming out of the shaft was cold, noticeably colder than the March air outside, carrying that mineral smell of wet stone and old earth that mines hold in their interiors like a signature. I was marking the location on my GPS, noting it for the property report as a potential hazard and liability issue, when I heard it. I didn't react immediately, because the sound was so unexpected that my brain needed a moment to categorize it, to run through the possibilities and eliminate the ones that didn't fit. Water dripping, no. Too regular, too metallic. Rock settling, no. Too rhythmic, too sustained. An animal? No, nothing organic about it. It was metal striking metal, and it was coming from inside the mine. I turned off the GPS and stood still and listened. The sound was distant but clear, carried up the shaft by the natural acoustics of the tunnel the way a pipe carries sound across a house. It was a hammering rhythm, a steady measured beat that repeated in a pattern I recognized from historical descriptions of hand mining. Strike, 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 pause, strike, 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 pause. The pattern of a man working a handheld steel drill into rock face, hammering the drill bit deeper with each blow, pausing to turn the bit a quarter rotation, then hammering again. It was the oldest form of hard rock mining, the method they'd used before pneumatic drills, before electricity, when the only tools were a hammer and a steel rod and the strength of the man swinging them. I knew what I was hearing. I knew it with a certainty that went beyond recognition into something more visceral, a knowledge that settled in my bones the way cold settles in stone. Someone was drilling rock inside that mine. The sound was too specific, too precisely rhythmic, too consistent to be anything else. The metallic ring of hammer on steel, the slight change in pitch as the bit deepened in the hole, the measured pause for rotation, it was a sound that had echoed through these mountains for 100 years. The sound of men extracting coal by hand from seams that ran through the dark interior of the earth, and it was happening right now, in a mine that had been abandoned for nearly 7 decades. I checked my phone. No signal, which was expected in this terrain. I checked my watch. It was 2:17 inches the afternoon. I stood at the entrance to that mine, and I listened to the tapping for 11 minutes by my watch, timing it, tracking the rhythm, confirming again and again that it was real and consistent, and not the product of water or wind, or the dozens of natural explanations that I kept generating and discarding. The rhythm never varied, the same pattern, the same pace, the same steady measured labor of a man working a drill into rock with the patient endurance of someone who had been doing it for a very long time and had no reason to stop. Left. I finished the boundary survey, working the rest of the day with the sound of that tapping in my ears, even after I'd moved far enough from the mine entrance that I shouldn't have been able to hear it anymore. I completed my flagging, shot my points, and hiked back to my truck as the light was failing. I drove home and opened my laptop and started searching. The mine was listed in the Virginia Department of Mines, Minerals, and Energy database as the Osborne Drift Mine, operated by the Breaks Mining Company from 1923 to 1952. It had produced bituminous coal from a seam that ran roughly east-west through the mountain at an elevation of about 2,400 feet. Production records showed modest output, the kind of small operation that employed maybe a dozen men at its peak, working the seam by hand in the early years, and with limited mechanization later. The mine had been closed following a roof collapse on the 14th of March 1952 that had trapped and killed 3 miners in a section approximately 600 feet from the entrance. Recovery operations had been attempted but abandoned after a second. Smaller collapse made the rescue tunnel unstable. The bodies had been left in place. The mine entrance had been sealed with a concrete block wall, which, based on what I'd seen, had since partially collapsed or been breached by the decades of freeze-thaw cycles that break apart everything man-made in these mountains eventually. 3 men had died in that mine 68 years before I stood at its entrance and heard the sound of hand drilling coming from its interior. 3 men whose bodies had never been recovered, who were still in there, entombed in the collapsed section 600 feet from daylight, left behind by a company that calculated the cost of retrieval against the value of the coal and decided the math didn't work. I found their names in the accident report. James Robert Osborne, age 41, William Dean Combs, age 33, Ernest Ray Sloan, age 27. 3 men who went to work on a Friday morning in March of 1952 and never came home. 3 men who were still in the dark, in the cold, in the silence of a mountain that had closed around them like a fist. And in that mine, 68 years later, someone was still working, still swinging a hammer, still driving a drill into rock with the steady, measured rhythm of a man doing the job he was paid to do, still producing the sound of labor from a tunnel that should have held nothing but rubble and bones and the permanent silence of the abandoned dead. I went back once, 2 weeks later, on a Saturday, alone, with no professional reason to be there. I told myself I was checking the GPS coordinates, verifying the data for the report, but that was a lie, and I knew it. I went back because I needed to hear it again, Needed to confirm that the sound was real, that my memory hadn't distorted it into something it wasn't. I stood at the entrance and I listened. The sound was there, the same rhythm, the same metallic ring, the same patient, endless tapping from 600 feet inside the mountain, from behind tons of collapsed rock, from a place where 3 men had been breathing air that got thinner and thinner until it couldn't sustain breathing anymore. I stood there and I listened to James Osborne and William Combs and Ernest Sloan working their shift, still drilling, still swinging, still doing the only thing they knew how to do, the thing the company had paid them to do, the thing that had brought them into the mountain on a March morning and kept them there when the roof came down and the light went out and the world above moved on without them. I included the mine location in my survey report. I noted it as a hazard. I recommended the entrance be properly sealed. I did not mention the tapping. I did not mention the sound of men working in a mine that had been their tomb for nearly 70 years. Because what would I say? Who would believe it? And what difference would it make? The mine is still there. The entrance is still open. The tapping, I'm certain, continues. 3 men, still working, still earning a wage that nobody will ever pay, still keeping to the rhythm of a shift that ended in 1952 and somehow never stopped. And sometimes, on quiet nights, when the house is still and the world outside is dark, I think about them down there. I think about the hammer and the drill and the cold and the dark and the unimaginable patience of men who have been working for 68 years in a mine that forgot to tell them they were dead. And I wonder if they know. I wonder if they're aware that the world above has changed, that the company is gone, that the towns are empty, that the coal they're drilling will never be loaded onto a car and hauled to the surface and sold. I wonder if they're trapped in a loop, a moment that replays endlessly, or if some part of them is conscious and choosing to continue, choosing work over the alternative, because the alternative is acknowledging what happened and sitting in the dark with nothing but silence and forever. I think they're still working because it's all they have left. And I think the mountain keeps the sound alive because the mountain remembers them, even if nobody else does. 3 names on an accident report, 3 men in the dark, and the sound of a hammer, steady and sure, echoing up a shaft that leads to a world that doesn't. I've hiked the backcountry of the George Washington National Forest since I was 16 years old, which gives me roughly 22 years of experience navigating terrain that ranges from gentle ridge walks to scrambles through boulder fields and laurel hills that would challenge anyone with less stubbornness than common sense. I'm not a casual hiker. I carry proper maps, I carry a compass, I carry a GPS unit in addition to my phone, and I pay attention to landmarks with the habitual awareness of someone who learned early that the mountains don't care how experienced you are and will punish complacency the same way they punish ignorance. I know how to read terrain. I know how to follow a trail, and I know how to find my way when there is no trail. I'm telling you this because what happened to me in October of 2021 on a 7-mile hike that I'd done at least a dozen times before should not have been possible. It violated everything I understand about navigation, about distance, about the fundamental relationship between walking in a direction and arriving at a destination. And I still don't have an explanation for it, which bothers me more than the experience itself, because I'm the kind of person who needs things to make sense, and this doesn't make sense, and I've accepted that it never will. The trail runs from a parking area off Forest Road 95 to a fire road that intersects Route 250 about 7 miles to the northeast. It's a well-maintained path through mixed hardwood forest, following a ridge for the first 3 miles, dropping into a drainage, crossing a creek, and climbing back up to the fire road through a series of switchbacks. The landmarks are distinct and memorable. About 2 miles in, you pass through a boulder field where house-sized chunks of sandstone sit in the forest like the ruins of something ancient. At 3 miles, a massive hemlock fell across the trail several years ago, and the Forest Service cut a notch in it rather than removing it, creating a distinctive passage that everyone who hikes this trail knows. At 4 miles, you cross the creek on a series of flat stones that someone placed there deliberately, maybe decades ago, creating a natural stepping stone bridge. These are the landmarks I'd used a dozen times to track my progress, and they'd always appeared in the right order, at the right intervals, confirming that I was where I expected to be and moving at the pace I expected to move. I left the parking area at noon on a Saturday. The weather was clear, mid-50s, the fall color near its peak, with the maples blazing orange, and the oaks just beginning to turn. Perfect hiking weather, the kind of day that draws you into the woods with the promise of beauty and the assurance of comfort. I was carrying a day pack with water, food, a rain layer, and my navigation gear. I planned to be at the fire road by 2:30, at my shuttle car by 3, and home by 5. Simple, routine. The kind of hike I could do in my sleep. The first 2 miles were normal. I walked at my usual pace, about 3 miles an hour on moderate terrain, and reached the boulder field right on schedule. I picked my way through the massive stones, ducked under the overhanging slab that always made me think of a doorway, and continued along the ridge. At 45 minutes, I reached the downed hemlock with its cut notch and stepped through, checking the time and confirming I was on pace. Everything was exactly as it should have been. The trail was clear, the landmarks were correct, the forest was doing what forests do in October, being beautiful and indifferent and entirely predictable. I reached the creek crossing at about 1:15. The flat stones were in their usual positions, the water running clear and shallow between them. I crossed, climbed the far bank, and started up the switchbacks toward the fire road. This was the home stretch, maybe 2.5 miles of steady climbing through oak forest to the road. I'd be there by 2:30, maybe 2:15, if I pushed the pace. At 2:30, I was still climbing. That was the first sign that something was wrong, though I didn't recognize it as such immediately. I assumed I'd been moving slower than I thought, maybe stopping more often to look at the foliage or take photographs. I checked my phone. The GPS showed me about a mile from the fire road, making normal progress on the correct trail. I picked up the pace. At 3 o'clock, I came around a bend in the trail and stopped. The boulder field was in front of me. The same boulder field I'd passed through 2 hours and 3 miles ago, with the same house-sized chunks of sandstone and the same overhanging slab that looked like a doorway. I stood there and stared at it and felt something shift in my chest, a lurch of disorientation that was physical as much as mental. This wasn't possible. The boulder field was near the beginning of the trail, miles behind me. I'd crossed the creek, I'd started the switchbacks, I'd been climbing toward the fire road. I could not be back at the boulder field. It was geographically, physically, mathematically impossible. I checked my GPS. It showed me a mile from the fire road, exactly where it had shown me 30 minutes earlier. According to my phone, I was making steady progress northeast along the correct trail. According to my eyes, I was standing in front of landmarks I'd passed 2 hours ago. I walked through the boulder field. I told myself there must be a second one, that I'd somehow failed to notice a similar rock formation further along the trail in all my previous hikes. I walked through it and continued, and 20 minutes later, I reached the downed hemlock with its cut notch. The same hemlock. I knew it was the same one because I'd carved my initials into the cut face years ago. A small mark I made on my first hike here, and there they were, exactly where I'd put them. I was back at mile 3. I had been walking forward on a trail I knew for 3 hours, and I was further from my destination than when I'd started. I sat down on the hemlock and drank some water and tried to think rationally. Somehow, I'd gotten turned around. Somehow, despite following a marked trail with clear blazes, I'd reversed direction without realizing it and walked back toward the trailhead. It was the only explanation that fit inside the laws of physics I understood. I must have made a wrong turn at the creek crossing, must have climbed back up the wrong side of the drainage, must have retraced my steps in a moment of inattention. It was embarrassing, but explicable. I stood up and started walking again, this time paying obsessive attention to the trail blazes, confirming each one, making sure I was moving in the correct direction. Northeast, toward the fire road. The blazes confirmed it. I was on trail, heading the right way, making the progress my GPS said I was making. 40 minutes later, I crossed the creek on the flat stepping stones. 30 minutes after that, I was back at the boulder field. The panic arrived quietly, not as a surge, but as a slow flooding, like water rising in a basement. I was looping. The trail was delivering me through the same landmarks in the same order at the same intervals, and no matter which direction I walked or how carefully I followed the blazes, I ended up back at the beginning of the same stretch of forest. Boulder field, hemlock, creek, switchbacks that led not to the fire road but back to the boulder field, a closed circuit, a treadmill of terrain that recycled itself with the mechanical precision of a track on a loop, and I was the only moving part. It was 4:30 now. The light was changing, the shadows lengthening, the forest transitioning from the bright openness of afternoon to the muted blue-gray of approaching dusk. I'd been walking for 4.5 hours on a hike that should have taken 2, and I was no closer to the fire road than I'd been at noon. My phone still showed me almost there. My phone was lying. I tried leaving the trail. I picked a bearing due east on my compass and walked straight into the forest, off trail, pushing through underbrush, climbing over fallen logs, descending into a small ravine, and climbing out the other side. I walked by compass for 30 minutes through trackless forest and emerged onto the trail at the downed hemlock. I'd walked half a mile through the woods in a straight line and arrived back on the loop as if the forest had simply redirected me, as if every path through these trees, on trail or off, led to the same sequence of landmarks. That's when I noticed the silence. It had been building, I realized, accumulating over the hours the way the loops accumulated, so gradually that I hadn't registered it as a change. But now, standing at the hemlock in the fading light, I heard it, or rather, I heard the absence of it. The forest was quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of late afternoon when the birds slow down and the insects shift to their evening register. Silent. The total cessation of biological sound, as if every living thing within earshot had left, had withdrawn from this section of forest, had evacuated an area centered on me and my endless loop, with the methodical completeness of an evacuation that followed a plan. I stood in that silence and I felt watched, not by anything I could see or hear or identify, but by the forest itself, by the terrain, by the loop that held me, as if the land had developed an awareness and was observing what I did with the patient curiosity of something that had all the time in the world. I walked the loop one more time, boulder field, hemlock, creek, and this time, at the creek crossing, something was different. The stepping stones were there, the water was there, but beyond the creek, the trail looked wrong. Not dramatically wrong, not altered in any obvious way, but wrong the way a familiar room looks wrong, when someone has moved the furniture an inch in every direction. The trees on the far side seemed closer together, the trail seemed narrower. The switchbacks beyond seemed steeper, tighter, leading not up toward a fire road, but down, deeper into the drainage, into terrain that was darker and denser than what I remembered. I didn't cross. I turned around and walked back toward the trailhead instead, following the trail in the direction I'd come from, and this time the forest let me go. The landmarks appeared in reverse order, and the trail delivered me to the parking area, where my car sat alone in the last gray light of dusk. I'd been walking for 6 hours. My GPS showed that I'd covered 7 miles, exactly the distance of the full trail, as if I'd completed the hike successfully from start to finish. My legs told a different story. They told me I'd walked much further than 7 miles. The soreness in my knees and the ache in my feet said something closer to 20. I drove to the fire road and picked up my shuttle car and went home and sat in my kitchen and looked at the GPS track on my phone. It showed a clean line from the parking area to the fire road. 7 miles, no loops, no reversals, no indication that anything unusual had happened. A perfectly normal hike recorded by a device that had apparently been in a different version of reality than I was. I haven't hiked that trail since. I've thought about it many times, have driven to the parking area and sat in my car and looked at the trailhead and thought about walking in and seeing if the trail behaves the way it's supposed to. But I haven't done it because I remember the silence. I remember the way the forest emptied itself around me as I walked my loops, the way every living thing withdrew until I was alone, in a way that went beyond solitude into something more fundamental, more deliberate, more aware. And I remember the creek crossing on that last loop, the way the trail beyond it looked wrong, the way it seemed to be offering me a new direction, not toward the fire road, but toward somewhere else, somewhere deeper, somewhere the forest wanted me to go. I think that's what the loops were for, not to trap me, but to tire me, to disorient me, to erode my judgment until I was exhausted enough and confused enough to take the path that was being offered, to cross the creek one more time and follow the trail down instead of up, into the darker and denser terrain that waited on the other side. I think the forest was patient. I think it would have let me loop all night if necessary, slowly clearing the area of every other living thing, slowly increasing the silence, slowly reshaping the trail beyond the creek, until I was too tired to notice the changes and too lost to care. And I think if I'd crossed that creek one more time, I wouldn't have come back. I think the trail would have taken me somewhere that doesn't appear on any map, to a place where the loops don't end, because there's no trailhead to return to. Where the forest closes behind you, the way a door closes behind someone entering a room they're not meant to leave. I chose to turn around. That's the only thing that saved me. I chose to go backward when every instinct and every blaze and every reading on my GPS was telling me to go forward. I chose wrong according to every instrument I had. My girlfriend Erin and I had been together about 2 years when we booked the cabin. We were both the kind of people who recharge through isolation rather than socializing, and the listing had appealed to us specifically because of what it promised to lack. No neighbors, no cell service, no noise except what the forest provided. The photos showed a small log cabin with a stone chimney, a covered porch facing south, and a clearing surrounded by old-growth hardwood that looked like it hadn't been logged in a century. The listing described it as a restored homestead, originally built in the 1930s by a family that had farmed the hollow before the National Forest absorbed the land. The owners had updated it with basic amenities: running water from a spring, a propane refrigerator, oil lamps for light, but had kept the character intact. No electricity, no Wi-Fi. The nearest paved road was 7 miles down a gravel track that the listing warned could be challenging in wet weather. We booked it for the weekend before Thanksgiving, 4 nights, and drove down from Asheville on a Thursday afternoon with the car packed full of groceries and books and the quiet anticipation of 4 days with nothing to do and nowhere to be. The drive took longer than expected. The gravel road that accessed the property was worse than the listing had suggested, not just unpaved but barely maintained, a single lane of packed dirt and loose stone that climbed through a series of switchbacks before dropping into the hollow where the cabin sat. The last 2 miles were essentially a creek bed, the road following the drainage so closely that in places we were driving through standing water. By the time we reached the clearing, it was late afternoon, the November sun already behind the ridge to the west, the hollow filling with the blue-gray shadow that precedes full dark in the mountains by about 30 minutes. The cabin looked exactly like the photos. That's the first thing I noted, and it mattered because I'd been burned before by rental listings that showed one thing and delivered another. But this was accurate: the same log walls, the same stone chimney, the same covered porch with 2 rocking chairs that faced the clearing. The clearing itself was maybe half an acre, ringed by hardwood forest, the trees big enough to suggest they'd been standing since before the cabin was built. It was quiet, deeply, thoroughly quiet, the kind of silence that you feel as a physical presence, a weight that settles on your shoulders and presses against your ears. I grabbed the first load of groceries and walked to the porch, while Erin got the cooler from the back seat. The steps were solid under my feet, the porch boards tight and well-maintained. The door was to my right, a heavy plank door with iron hinges and a simple latch. And it was open. Not wide open, but ajar, the latch not engaged. The door pushed inward maybe 3 inches, enough that I could see a sliver of the dim interior through the gap. I set the groceries down and pushed the door the rest of the way open and stepped inside, expecting to find the stale, cold air of a cabin that had been shut up between guests. What I found instead was warmth. The main room was small, maybe 15 by 20 feet, with the wood stove against the far wall, a kitchen area to the left with a counter and a propane stove and open shelving, and a sitting area to the right, with a couple of worn armchairs and a rag rug on the plank floor. A ladder in the corner led to a sleeping loft. The wood stove was a cast iron box style, and I could feel its heat from across the room, not intense but present, the radiating warmth of iron that had been heated within the last few hours and was slowly cooling. I walked to it and held my hand near the surface. Warm. Not hot enough to burn, but warm enough to confirm that a fire had been burning in it recently, probably within the last 2 to 3 hours based on the rate at which cast iron loses heat. I opened the firebox door. Inside were ashes, gray and white, with a few chunks of charred wood that still held their shape. The coals were dead, but the ash bed was warm to the back of my hand when I held it close. Someone had built a fire in this stove, a real fire with split wood, and had let it burn down, and the cabin was still holding the heat. I turned to the kitchen table. It was a simple plank table with 2 chairs, positioned under a window that looked out at the tree line. One of the chairs was pulled out from the table, angled slightly, the way a chair looks when someone has pushed it back to stand up. And on the table, in front of that chair, sat a mug. I picked it up. Coffee. Not hot, not even warm, but liquid, the surface undisturbed, no mold, no film. Coffee that had been poured and partially drunk, and left there by someone who hadn't finished it. Erin came in behind me with the cooler and stopped in the doorway. "It's warm in here," she said, and I could hear the question in her voice, the same confusion I was feeling. "Someone was here," I said, "recently." I climbed the ladder to the loft. The sleeping area was a simple platform with a mattress covered in quilts, the kind of handmade patchwork that you find in mountain cabins throughout the southern Appalachians. The bed was unmade. The sheets were pulled back on the left side, folded over at an angle that looked natural, undeliberate, the way bedding looks when someone has simply gotten up and not bothered to make the bed. The pillow on that side bore the impression of a head, a shallow oval depression in the center where someone's skull had rested, and I stood there looking at it with a feeling that was not yet fear, but was moving in that direction. A slow, creeping awareness that we were not the first people in this cabin today. I climbed back down and checked the rest of the room more carefully. On the kitchen counter near the sink sat a plate with crumbs on it, the remains of bread or toast. A knife with a trace of butter on the blade lay beside it. In the sink, a glass with a water ring at the bottom. By the wood stove, on the floor, a pair of wool socks, balled up and discarded, as if someone had pulled them off while sitting in the armchair and dropped them. The socks were dry, but they smelled worn, carrying the faint scent of a body that had been wearing them. Everything in the cabin told the story of a person in the middle of an ordinary morning. Someone who had woken up, made coffee, eaten toast, sat by the fire, pulled off their socks. Someone who had been living here, comfortably, recently, with the ease of a person in their own home. I went back outside and stood on the porch and looked at the ground. The clearing around the cabin was soft earth, covered in a thin layer of fallen leaves that had been compressed by recent rain into a surface that held prints well. I could see our footprints clearly, my boots and Erin's, leading from the car to the porch in a straight line. I could see the tire tracks from our car, and that was all. No other footprints, no other tire tracks. No indication that any other person had walked across that clearing in any direction since the last rain, which, based on the moisture content of the ground, had been within the last 24 hours. Whoever had been in that cabin had not walked out the front door, had not walked across the clearing to a car or a path or the gravel road, had not left any mark on the soft ground outside that would indicate their departure by any route I could see. I walked the perimeter of the cabin. The back wall had no door, just two small windows, both latched from the inside. The sides had one window each, also latched. The only entrance was the front door, the one that had been standing ajar when we arrived. I checked the ground beneath every window. Undisturbed leaves, no prints, no scuff marks, no indication that anyone had climbed in or out. Erin was standing in the doorway watching me. "Should we call someone?" she asked. I checked my phone. No signal, as expected. "There's no one to call," I said. "And we're 3 hours from home, and it's getting dark." We stayed. I know how that sounds, and I've questioned the decision many times since. But the cabin was exactly what we'd booked. The door showed no signs of forced entry, nothing was damaged or vandalized, and the practical reality was that we had nowhere else to go. The gravel road was bad enough in daylight and would have been dangerous in the dark, and the nearest town was an hour away. So we unpacked, and I built a new fire in the stove, and Erin made dinner, and we settled in and tried to convince ourselves that the previous occupant had been a maintenance person or the property owner checking on the cabin between guests. But the coffee, the unmade bed, the wool socks on the floor, those weren't the signs of someone checking a property. Those were the signs of someone living there, someone who'd spent the night and woken up and had breakfast and sat by the fire, and then simply ceased to be there, leaving everything behind, as if they'd stepped out of reality instead of out of the cabin. We slept in the loft that night, in the bed that someone else had slept in the night before, and I lay awake for a long time listening to the cabin settle and the fire crackle and the forest outside hold its heavy silence. Erin fell asleep before me, and I watched the shadows that the stove light cast on the ceiling, and I thought about the impression in the pillow and whose head had made it and where that head was now. I heard footsteps at 3:17 inches the morning. Soft, measured, crossing the main room below the loft with the careful tread of someone who knew the layout of the cabin well enough to navigate it in the dark. 4 steps, maybe 5, from the direction of the front door to the wood stove. Then a pause. Then the sound of the stove door opening, the familiar creak of cast iron hinges that I'd heard when I'd opened it myself hours earlier. Then a settling sound, like someone lowering themselves into one of the armchairs. Then nothing. I didn't move. I didn't wake Aaron. I lay in that loft and stared at the ceiling and listened to the nothing that followed the footsteps. And I knew with a certainty that bypassed rational thought and settled directly into my body that someone was sitting in the armchair, below me, in the dark, in front of the wood stove, as comfortable and as calm as a person in their own home, because it was their home. That's what I understood, lying there in the dark with my heart beating so hard I could feel it in the mattress. The cabin wasn't between guests. The cabin was occupied, had been occupied, perhaps, for a very long time, by someone who didn't show up in footprints or tire tracks, who didn't leave through doors, who lived in the rhythms of the cabin, the fire, the coffee, the bread, the socks, the bed the way a current lives in a wire, invisibly, permanently, moving through the structure without disturbing its surface. We left at first light, packed in 15 minutes, threw everything in the car, drove that terrible gravel road in silence with the heater blasting and the morning fog pressing against the windshield. I looked back once, in the rearview mirror, as the cabin disappeared behind the trees. The front door was closed. I'd left it open. I contacted the rental company when we got back to Asheville. I described what we'd found, the warm stove, the coffee, the unmade bed. The woman on the phone was quiet for a moment and then said, in a tone that was careful and practiced, that the cabin had been unoccupied for 2 weeks before our booking. No maintenance visits, no owner checks. She said sometimes previous guests left things behind, that the cleaning service might have missed some items. She offered a partial refund. She didn't explain the warm stove. She didn't explain the coffee that was still liquid. She didn't explain the footprints that didn't exist or the footsteps that I heard crossing the cabin floor at 3 in the morning. She didn't explain those things because they can't be explained, because whatever is living in that cabin at the head of that hollow in the Nantahala doesn't fit inside an explanation that a rental company can offer. I check the listing sometimes. It's still active, still showing the same photos, the same description, the same promise of isolation and quiet. The reviews are mostly positive, but every few months there's one that mentions something odd. A warm stove, a mug on the table, an impression in the pillow. The reviewers describe it the way I would have described it before that night, curiously, without alarm, as a small mystery easily dismissed. None of them mention the footsteps. I wonder if they heard them and chose not to mention it, or if the footsteps were only for us, or if whoever lives in that cabin only walks when they know you're listening, only moves through the room when someone is lying in their bed, in their loft, in the place they've been sleeping and waking. I work for the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality, which is a title that sounds more impressive than the job usually is. Most of what I do involves driving to remote locations throughout the western part of the state, checking water quality monitoring stations that are installed along streams and rivers in the national forests, downloading data, replacing batteries, making sure the equipment is functioning. It's solitary work that puts me on roads most people don't know exist, at hours most people would consider unreasonable, in terrain that is beautiful during the day and something else entirely after dark. I've been doing it for 6 years, and I've developed a particular relationship with the George Washington National Forest that comes from spending hundreds of hours alone in its interior, driving its roads, walking its drainages, learning its moods. Because the forest has moods. That's not poetry or metaphor. Anyone who spends enough time in a large wilderness will tell you that the character of a place changes, not just with the seasons or the weather, but with something less measurable, some quality of atmosphere that shifts from day to day and sometimes from hour to hour, as if the forest itself has states of mind that it moves through the way a person moves through emotions. Most days, the George Washington feels neutral, indifferent, a vast organism going about its business without regard for the small human moving through its margins. Some days it feels welcoming, and some days, on some roads, at some hours, it feels like something that knows you're there and has opinions about your presence. The night I'm talking about was in October of 2021. I'd spent the afternoon checking stations along a tributary of the Cowpasture River, a drainage that runs through one of the more remote sections of the forest in Bath County. The work had taken longer than expected because one of the stations had been damaged by a fallen tree, and I'd had to do field repairs that ate up the remaining daylight. By the time I'd packed my equipment and gotten back to the truck, it was past 7 and fully dark. The kind of darkness that you only get in a mountain valley, where the ridges block the horizon in every direction, and the canopy overhead blocks the sky, and the nearest artificial light is miles away. I had maybe 40 minutes of driving ahead of me on a Forest Service road that would eventually connect to the state highway near Warm Springs. 40 minutes of single-lane gravel through a valley that was, at that hour, as dark and empty as any place I'd ever been. I started driving. The road was typical Forest Service construction, a narrow gravel track graded for maintenance vehicles, with pull-offs every quarter mile or so where oncoming traffic could pass. The surface was rough but manageable at 15 miles an hour, which was my usual pace on these roads at night. The headlights created a tunnel of illumination that extended maybe 40 feet ahead, beyond which everything was black. The trees pressed close on both sides, hardwoods mostly, their bare October branches creating a lattice overhead that occasionally opened to show a sliver of sky before closing again. I had the radio off because the reception in these valleys was non-existent, and the only sounds were the engine and the tires on gravel and the occasional scrape of a branch against the side mirror. I'd been driving for about 10 minutes when I saw the movement. It was in my peripheral vision, on the left side of the road, in the strip of forest between the road edge and the darkness beyond. A shape, dark against the dark, moving parallel to the truck. My first thought was deer. October in the George Washington, deer are everywhere, and seeing one moving along the tree line was completely ordinary. But even as the thought formed, I knew it was wrong, because the movement was wrong. A deer moves with a particular gait, the careful, high-stepping walk, the bouncing trot, the explosive burst of a startled run. This was none of those. This was fluid, continuous, a smooth forward motion that had no visible stride pattern, no up and down bounce, no rhythm that I could associate with any four-legged animal. And it was tall, taller than a deer, taller than the underbrush it was moving through, tall enough that I could see it above the mountain laurel that grew along the road's edge, which meant it was at least 6 feet at the top of its form, probably more. I focused on the road and told myself it was a shadow, a trick of the headlights, the kind of optical illusion that the brain creates when you're tired and driving in the dark, and the world outside your windshield is a moving wall of shapes that your visual cortex is struggling to interpret. I told myself this and I drove for another 30 seconds, and then I looked again and it was still there. It was keeping pace with the truck exactly, not approximately, not roughly exactly. Moving at precisely 15 miles an hour through forest terrain that should have made that pace impossible, gliding between trunks and through underbrush with a fluidity that suggested the obstacles weren't obstacles at all, that the trees and the laurel and the rocks on the forest floor were no more impediment to this thing than air. I could see it in fragments as it passed between the trunks, catching the edge of my headlight beam for a fraction of a second before disappearing behind the next tree and reappearing in the gap beyond. Dark, tall, thin, but not in the way a person is thin. Thin the way a shadow is thin, a vertical darkness that moved through the forest with the silence and precision of something that belonged there in a way that I did not. I sped up, pressed the accelerator, and brought the truck from 15 to 20 miles an hour, which was faster than I should have been driving on that surface in the dark. The shape matched me, instantly, without acceleration, without a visible change in its movement. One moment it was keeping pace at 15, the next it was keeping pace at 20, as if speed were a setting it could adjust rather than a physical constraint it had to work against. I pushed to 25. The truck was bouncing on the rough gravel now, the suspension complaining, and I was gripping the wheel with both hands and dividing my attention between the road ahead and the shape in my peripheral vision. It matched me at 25. Same distance, same position, same fluid, impossible movement through terrain that should have slowed it down and didn't. I took my foot off the gas and let the truck coast, slowing gradually. 20, 15, 10. The shape slowed with me, maintaining its position with a precision that was mechanical in its perfection, as if an invisible rod connected it to my truck, and whatever I did, whatever speed I chose, it would be there, 20 feet to my left, moving through the trees with that terrible silent fluidity. I drove. There was nothing else to do. The road was the only way out of the valley, and stopping felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate but felt absolutely in my body. A deep mammalian certainty that stopping the truck would change the nature of what was happening, would shift the dynamic from escort to encounter, and that encounter was something I did not want. So I drove, both hands on the wheel, eyes mostly on the road, allowing myself only brief glances to the left, where the shape continued its parallel course through the dark forest. 7 miles. I know this because I checked the odometer when it started and checked it again when it stopped, and the distance between those two readings was 7.2 miles. 7 miles of gravel road through a dark valley with something walking beside my truck in the trees, matching every change in speed without effort, maintaining its distance without variation, accompanying me through territory that it apparently considered its domain with the quiet authority of a landowner walking a visitor to the gate. I began to notice things during those 7 miles that I might not have noticed if my senses hadn't been sharpened to a degree I'd never experienced before. The forest was silent, not quiet silent, the total absence of sound that I'd come to associate with something wrong in the woods, something that made every living thing in the area go still and hold its breath. No owl, no coyote, no rustle of small animals in the leaf litter, just the engine and the gravel and the silence and the shape. I also noticed that my headlights seemed dimmer, not failing, not flickering, but reduced, as if the beams were being absorbed by the darkness rather than pushing through it. The tunnel of light that normally extended 40 feet ahead had shrunk to maybe 25, and the quality of the light had changed, becoming yellower, warmer, as if the bulbs were being starved of current. I checked the dashboard, all gauges normal, battery, alternator, everything reading where it should. But the light was diminished, and the darkness that pressed in from both sides felt thicker, denser, more present than darkness usually feels. At the 7-mile mark, the road crossed a small bridge over a creek, and on the far side, the valley widened slightly, the ridges pulling back, the canopy opening enough to show a strip of sky with actual stars. And the shape was gone. Not gradually, not receding into the distance, not falling behind as the terrain changed. Just gone, between one glance and the next, absent from the tree line as completely as if it had never been there. The forest was still silent for another minute or so, and then, slowly, the normal sounds returned: a distant owl, the creek below the bridge, the small, restless noises of a living forest, resuming its business after a held breath. I drove the remaining 20 minutes to the state highway without stopping. When I reached the pavement and the first distant lights of Warm Springs appeared through the trees, I pulled over and sat in the truck for a long time with the engine running and my hands shaking and the heater blasting air that couldn't seem to reach the cold that had settled inside me. I've driven that road since. The job requires it. The monitoring stations need servicing and the data needs collecting, and the forest doesn't care about my comfort or my fear. I've driven it in daylight and I've driven it after dark, and I've never seen the shape again. But I've felt it. On certain nights, on certain stretches, I've felt the quality of the darkness change, felt the silence settle in, felt the headlights dim almost imperceptibly, and I've known that something was there in the trees, pacing me, watching, deciding whether to show itself or simply observe. I've asked other people who work in the forest, rangers, maintenance crews, other technicians. Most give me the same blank look that people give when you describe something they haven't experienced and can't imagine. But a few, a very few, have nodded. One ranger, a woman who'd worked the Bath County District for 18 years, listened to my description and then said, very quietly, that the valley I was describing had a reputation. She said people had been reporting something walking beside vehicles on that road for as long as she'd been there, and probably longer. She said the reports were always the same: something tall, something dark, something that kept pace and maintained distance and accompanied you through the valley and stopped at the creek. She said it was territorial. She said it wasn't hostile, as far as anyone could tell. She said it just wanted you to keep moving. I asked her what it was. She looked at me for a long moment, and then she said, with the particular honesty of someone who has given up trying to explain something and decided to simply state it, that she didn't know, that nobody knew, that the forest was old and the mountains were older, and that some things lived in them that didn't have names because they existed before names were invented, before language was invented, before the human mind developed the tools necessary to categorize and contain what the darkness holds. I still drive that road. I still check those stations. And on the nights when the valley is dark and the silence settles in and I feel the air change around my truck, I keep my speed steady and my eyes on the road, and I don't look to the left, because I know it's there, and I know it's watching. And I know that as long as I keep moving, as long as I don't stop, as long as I respect whatever boundary the creek represents, it will walk beside me and let me pass. I've lived in a hollow outside Hazard, Kentucky, my entire life. 53 years in the same house my grandfather built with his own hands on land the family has owned since before the Civil War. I'm telling you that so you understand something important. I am not a man who spooks easy. I am not a man prone to imagination or fantasy or late-night panic. I have buried dogs and parents and a brother. I have walked these woods in every season, in every kind of dark. I know what belongs out here, and I know what doesn't. The house sits at the bottom of a hollow, tucked between two ridges that rise up steep on either side, like the walls of a trough. Behind the house, the ground levels out for maybe 40 yards before it slopes up again into dense hardwood oak and hickory mostly, some poplar, a few hemlocks that have somehow survived the woolly adelgid. There's a creek that runs along the eastern ridge, and in the spring it sounds like a conversation you can't quite make out. In the winter it freezes into silence. Everything out here has a sound and a season, and I have learned them the way you learn the voice of someone you love. I don't have to think about it, I just know. The first time I noticed it, I was 31 years old. That would have been the winter of 2002, early November, one of those nights where the temperature drops so fast the trees pop and crack like gunshots. I was lying in bed, not sleeping, just staring at the ceiling and listening to the house settle the way old houses do. And then I felt it, not heard, felt. A low vibration that came up through the mattress and into my spine, so faint at first that I thought it was my own heartbeat. But it wasn't. It was too slow, too deep, too steady. I put my hand flat on the floor, and it was there, unmistakable, a pulse rising up through the foundation and the earth beneath it. I got up and walked through the house. I checked the furnace. I checked the water heater. I went outside in my boots and long johns and stood in the yard with my breath clouding in front of me, and I could feel it through the soles of my boots, coming from the ground, from deep in the ground, a rhythm, like breathing. Slow and vast and impossibly low, the kind of sound that isn't really a sound at all but a pressure, a weight on your chest, a hum in your teeth. It lasted until just before dawn, and then it stopped. Not faded, stopped. Like something had opened its eyes and held its breath. I told myself it was geological, old mines maybe, or some underground water feature shifting with the temperature. Perry County is riddled with abandoned coal mines, and strange things happen when those tunnels collapse or flood. I told myself that, and I believed it, mostly, and I went on with my life. But it came back. The next night, and the night after that, always starting around 2 in the morning, always stopping before first light. And only in the cold months, October through February, sometimes bleeding into early March if the winter held on. Come spring, it vanished entirely. The ground went quiet, and every fall, right around the time the leaves turned and the first hard frost crept down the ridges, it started again. I started sleeping less. Not because I was afraid, exactly, but because once you notice a thing like that, you can't unnotice it. I'd lie there in the dark and feel it come on, that slow, deep pulse, and my whole body would tense up like I was waiting for something to happen. Nothing ever did. It just breathed. That's the only word I've ever found for it. The earth behind my house breathed, and I lay there and listened to it breathe, and I felt like I was eavesdropping on something I was never meant to hear. After a few years of this, I called the county extension office and asked if they could send someone out. They put me in touch with a geologist at the university in Lexington, a young guy named Harmon, who drove down on a Saturday with a trunk full of equipment. I liked him. He was serious and thorough, didn't patronize me, didn't look at me like I was some hollering hillbilly who'd heard a raccoon in his crawl space. He spent 2 days on the property. He used ground-penetrating radar, seismographs, soil sensors I didn't know the names of. He mapped the geology of the hollow down to 60 feet, and he found nothing. No caves, no voids, no abandoned shafts, no underground streams or aquifers. The bedrock was solid sandstone and shale, undisturbed, unremarkable. He told me the vibration could be infrasound from a distant industrial source, a compressor station, a ventilation fan in a working mine carried through the rock in ways that were hard to trace. He said it could be a natural resonance effect, the shape of the hollow acting like a bowl that amplified some low-frequency source miles away. He said these things, and I could see he didn't fully believe them, because none of them explained why it only happened in winter, and only at night, and only behind my house. He left, and I never heard from him again. The years went on. I got used to it the way you get used to a bad knee or a crack in the ceiling. It became part of the house, part of the season, part of what winter meant in that hollow. But I noticed things, small things that I couldn't quite connect to the sound but couldn't separate from it either. The deer avoided the back of the property in winter. They'd browse the hillside in summer, come right up to the garden fence. But once October hit, they stayed on the ridges and wouldn't come down into the flat ground behind the house. The dogs I've always kept hounds wouldn't go past the woodshed after dark in the cold months. They'd stand at the edge of the yard and whine and tuck their tails and refuse to move. I had one old walker, smartest dog I ever owned, who would press herself against the front door on those nights and tremble until I let her inside. She'd crawl under the bed and stay there until morning. She knew something. They all knew something. One night in January, maybe 2015 or 2016, I did something I'd been avoiding for years. I went out back during the vibration. It was around 3 in the morning, clear sky, half moon, cold enough that the air hurt my lungs. I walked past the woodshed and out into the flat ground, and I stood there and I felt it. It was stronger out there, much stronger than in the house. It came up through my boots and into my legs, and I could feel it in my stomach, in my chest, a pressure that wasn't painful but was deeply, fundamentally wrong, like standing on the chest of something enormous that was breathing in its sleep. The ground was not moving, I want to be clear about that. There was no visible tremor, no shifting of the soil, but the vibration was real, and it was alive in a way I cannot explain and have stopped trying to. I stood there for maybe 5 minutes, and then I felt something change. The rhythm shifted. It didn't speed up exactly, but there was a hesitation in it, a break in the pattern, like a sleeper stirring, like something becoming aware. I walked back to the house and I did not run, but I wanted to, and I have not gone out there during the vibration since. I'm 63 now. My knees are bad and my hearing isn't what it was, but I can still feel it. Every winter, right on schedule, the breathing starts. I've asked the older people in the hollow about it, the ones who've been here as long as I have or longer. Most of them look at me blankly. A few nod and change the subject. One woman, Edith Combs, who was 94 when she told me this before she passed, said her grandmother used to say the mountain was alive, and that the old people, the ones who were here before anyone, before the Cherokee even knew not to build in the hollows because that was where it slept. She said it like she was telling me the time. No drama, no fear, just a fact as plain and old as the dirt itself. I don't know what's under my house. I don't know what's under this hollow. I've stopped asking, because asking implies that an answer exists, that there's some explanation waiting to be found, some rational process that accounts for a sound that comes from solid rock every winter like clockwork, and feels like the respiration of something so large and so deep that the word creature doesn't begin to cover it. I don't think there is an answer. I think there are just things in these mountains that are older than answers, older than questions, older than the language we'd use to describe them, and they don't care that we're here. They don't even know. We built our houses on top of something that was sleeping long before we arrived, and it will go on sleeping long after we're gone, and on certain winter nights, its breath rises through the stone and the soil and the floorboards, and the dogs tremble, and the deer stay on the ridges, and I lie in my bed and feel the slow, vast pulse of something I will never understand moving beneath me in the dark. I don't tell people about it anymore. There's nothing to tell, really. Just a sound that isn't a sound. Just a feeling that doesn't belong to anything. Just the earth, breathing, in a hollow outside Hazard, Kentucky, the way it has been breathing since long before my grandfather built this. There's an old county road in Pendleton County, West Virginia, that I'd been meaning to walk for the better part of 2 years before I finally did it. I'm a local historian, not professionally, not in any way that pays, but in the way that certain people in rural places become the keepers of what happened, and where, and to whom. I'd been working on a project for the County Historical Society, documenting settlements that had been abandoned in the 20th century, places where people had lived and worshipped and buried their dead, and then, for one reason or another, left. There were more of them than you'd think. Whole communities that just emptied out between the Depression and the end of the century, swallowed back up by the forest, until there was nothing left but foundations and chimney stones and the occasional family cemetery with its iron fence rusting into the hillside. The settlement at the crossroads, 3 churches, and a scattering of homes that had once served the families farming the bottomland along the creek was one of the last on my list, and I'd been putting it off. Not for any reason I could name. I just kept finding excuses not to go. I finally drove out there on a Saturday in late October of 2021. The weather was cool and overcast, the kind of gray autumn day where the clouds sit right on top of the ridges and the color bleeds out of everything. I parked my truck at the gap where the old road splits off from the maintained highway, pulled on my boots, grabbed my camera and a notebook, and started walking. The road was in worse shape than I expected. It hadn't been maintained in nearly 30 years by that point, and the mountains had been taking it back with the slow patience that mountains have. The pavement was buckled and split, heaved up in plates by decades of frost, and in places the trees had pushed right through saplings first, then proper trees, their roots cracking the asphalt like it was nothing. The shoulder on the creek side had slumped away in long, muddy scallops, and in a few spots the road was barely wider than a footpath. It was quiet. Not silent, there were birds, and the creek was running but quiet in the way that places get when no one has been in them for a long time. A settled quiet, a quiet that has weight. I walked for maybe 20 minutes before I noticed the footprints. The road dipped through a low spot where a seep came down off the ridge and spread across the pavement in a shallow tongue of mud. It wasn't deep, maybe half an inch, but it was soft enough to take an impression, and there in the middle of it were boot prints. Clear, sharp-edged, fresh. The mud hadn't begun to slump back into them. The edges hadn't softened or dried. Someone had walked through that seep within the last few hours, maybe less. The prints were heading in the same direction I was toward the crossroads. A man's boots, judging by the size, with a heavy lug sole. Deliberate steps, evenly spaced, right down the center of the road. I stood there and looked at them for a while, and felt something I want to be honest about, because it matters to the rest of what I'm going to tell you. I felt uneasy, not afraid, not yet, but unsettled in a way that didn't match the situation. Someone else had walked this road, that was all. A hunter maybe, or another curious local, or a hiker who'd wandered off a trail. There was no reason for the prickling at the back of my neck, no reason for the way my stomach had tightened. But the feeling was there, and I've learned over the years to pay attention to feelings like that, even when I can't justify them, especially when I can't justify them. I kept walking. The road climbed a little, and then leveled out along the side of the ridge, and wherever there was mud or soft ground, the prints were there, always ahead of me, always fresh, always that same steady, even stride. I started paying closer attention to them, the way you do when something has gotten under your skin and you can't let it go. The spacing never changed, not on the uphill sections, not on the downhill, not where the road narrowed and the footing got tricky. Most people shorten their stride going uphill. Most people adjust when the terrain changes. These prints didn't. They marched forward with a regularity that was almost mechanical, as if whoever was making them wasn't reacting to the road at all, just moving through it. I told myself I was overthinking it. I told myself a lot of things on that walk. About a mile in, I started calling out. Nothing dramatic, just a loud hello, "Hey, anybody up ahead?" The kind of thing you do in the woods when you want to announce yourself. My voice sounded strange in that hollow, flat and small, like the trees were absorbing it before it could travel. Nobody answered. I hadn't expected anyone to, but the silence that came back felt purposeful, not empty. Listening. The road curved around the base of the ridge and dropped into a stretch of bottomland where the creek ran close alongside it. The trees were thicker here, the canopy lower, and even though it was midday, the light had a dim, underwater quality. The boot prints continued through a patch of clay where the road had washed out, and I knelt down to look at them more closely. They were perfect. That's the word I keep coming back to. Too perfect. No scuffing, no lateral movement, no sign that the person had shifted their weight or hesitated or looked around. Each print was planted squarely and lifted cleanly, like a demonstration of walking rather than the act itself. I put my own boot next to one of them for scale. The print was slightly larger than mine and deeper, as if the person was heavy or was pressing down with more force than a normal stride would produce. I almost turned back. I want you to know that. I crouched there in the mud beside that unnervingly precise footprint, and I thought about walking back to my truck and driving home and never thinking about any of this again. But I was less than a mile from the crossroads by then, and I'd come all this way, and the rational part of my mind, the historian's mind, the part that deals in documents and dates and verifiable facts, was embarrassed by the fear. So I stood up and kept going. The last half mile was the worst. The road narrowed to almost nothing, choked on both sides by rhododendron so dense it formed a tunnel, and the light dropped to a greenish gray that made my watch hard to read. The creek was louder here, close enough to hear individual rocks in the current, and something about the sound of it bothered me, some irregularity I couldn't identify, some pattern in the water noise that didn't match what water is supposed to do. The boot prints were everywhere now, in every patch of soft ground, steady and relentless, and always ahead of me. I was walking fast, almost jogging, and I couldn't close the distance. I never saw the person. I never heard them. I just followed their tracks through that green tunnel like I was being led. The road opened up suddenly, the way roads do in the mountains when you come through a gap, and there was the crossroads. 3 churches, or what was left of them. One was just a foundation and a chimney, the stone blackened by an old fire. The second had collapsed in on itself, the roof caved in and the walls leaning inward like a man folding his arms. The third was still mostly standing, white clapboard gone gray, the windows empty, the door hanging open on one hinge. They sat at the intersection of the old county road and a track that came down from the ridge, forming a rough triangle around the crossroads. It was the kind of place that should have felt historical, interesting, worthy of documentation. It didn't. It felt like a place where something had been decided a long time ago, and the decision still hung in the air. I walked to the center of the intersection and looked down. The boot prints came up the road behind me, following the same path I just walked, and they entered the crossroads, and they stopped. Right there. In the middle of the intersection, in a patch of bare ground between the cracked pavement, the last 2 prints sat side by side, toes pointing forward, perfectly placed, as if the person had taken one final step and then simply ceased. There were no prints leading away. Not toward the churches, not down the track, not off the road into the brush. I walked the entire intersection on my hands and knees, checking every inch of soft ground, every margin of mud and clay. Nothing. The prints walked in and they stopped, and there was nowhere they went after that. I stood in the intersection for a long time. The air was cold and absolutely still, and the 3 dead churches watched me from their corners, and I could hear the creak somewhere below the road and my own breathing and nothing else. I took photographs. I wrote notes. I did the things a historian does when confronted with something he cannot explain, which is to document it and move on and hope that the explanation will come later, in the quiet safety of a desk and a lamp and a rational mind. Then I walked back to my truck, 3 miles, moving fast, not running but wanting to. I did not look at the boot prints on the way out, but I could feel them there beside my own, that perfect measured stride keeping pace with me all the way back to the gap. I've been back to the crossroads twice since then, both times in summer, both times with someone else. The churches are still there, the road is still crumbling. I never found the prints again, but I never found them gone. Either the mud had dried and frozen and thawed and been washed over by rain, and whatever record the ground had kept was erased. The county records for that settlement are thin. A few families, a few decades of worship and farming, and then a slow emptying out that was complete by the 1970s. Nothing dramatic. Nothing to explain why 3 churches stood at one crossroads, which is more than most communities that size ever built. Nothing to explain who walked that road ahead of me, matching my direction, exceeding my pace, leaving prints that were too perfect and too deep, and that ended in the exact center of a place where people used to pray. I finished the history project. It was well received. I did not include the crossroads settlement in the final report. When people ask me why, I tell them the research was inconclusive, that there wasn't enough material to justify a full entry. That's true, as far as it goes. What I don't tell them is that some nights I lie awake and think about those footprints ending in the middle of that intersection, and I think about the word ending, and how it can mean the place where something stops, or the place where something is completed, and I'm not sure which kind of ending I found out there. I'm not sure I want to know. I'm not sure knowing is something that's available to me, or to anyone, or that it ever was. Some roads go places you can follow. Some roads go places that only exist for the person walking them. And some roads, the old ones, the ones the mountains are swallowing back, go to places that don't have names and don't need them, because no one